The mother-in-law threw a 3-day feast for 50 people in my house, leaving me with a debt of $250,000 and total devastation. While I was lying in intensive care, they were celebrating her anniversary. Upon returning home, I uttered one sentence and everyone turned pale. But before we continue, please tell me which country you are watching this video from. Enjoy listening. Victoria cherished her home, a home she had built with her own hands. She often thought, glancing around the cozy living room with a smile. Not literally, of course. She hadn't laid bricks or tiled the roof, but the down payment, the mortgage, the renovations, all of it was her earnings. Even before marriage, she, young and ambitious, dreamed of her own little corner, a sanctuary from the world's hustle, a place where she could simply be herself. And then, the dream materialized. A charming 2-story house on a quiet lane, complete with a small garden and an apple tree, delighted the eye and warmed the soul. When Sergei, her future husband, moved in after their wedding, he seemed to settle in quickly. Without contributing a single penny or making any effort, he accepted everything as a given. Victoria didn't object. She longed for a family, for warmth and comfort, and she was ready to share everything she possessed. Initially, Sergei was sweet and attentive, or at least he tried to appear so. He praised her cooking, admired her interior design taste, and promised to love her forever. Victoria believed him. She wanted to believe, but over time, the rose-tinted glasses began to slip. Sergei increasingly stayed late at work. His compliments became perfunctory, and his help around the house dwindled to nothing. He grew accustomed to comfort, to things simply getting done. He started taking the house for granted as something self-evident, forgetting who was responsible for this prosperity. His mother, Svetlana Pavlovna, stood out particularly. The mother-in-law took an instant dislike to Victoria. Perhaps she was envious of her independence. Perhaps she believed her son deserved a better match. Svetlana Pavlovna constantly criticized Victoria's cooking, her attire, her housekeeping. Nothing escaped her scrutinizing gaze. Nothing earned her praise. "When I was your age," she would begin her tirades, and Victoria knew a long list of her shortcomings would follow. Svetlana Pavlovna considered it her duty to offer valuable advice which was, in reality, veiled reproaches. "You're working too much, Vika," she would say. "You're not caring for your husband enough. A man should feel like the head of the household, and you overshadow him with your career." Or, "I don't understand why you need this garden. It's just a waste of time and money. You should buy yourself a new fur coat." Victoria tried to ignore her mother-in-law's sarcastic remarks. She understood that Svetlana Pavlovna was simply trying to assert herself at her expense. She attempted to maintain peace within the family, wanting to avoid arguments and scandals. She hoped that in time Svetlana Pavlovna would accept her, seeing her not as a rival, but as a loving wife to her son. Unfortunately, Sergei didn't support Victoria's pursuit of peace. He preferred to maintain a neutral stance, not interfering in the conflicts between his wife and mother. "My mother is just like that," he'd say, shrugging. "You know how she is. Just ignore it." But how could she ignore it when every visit from her mother-in-law turned into an ordeal? Victoria tried to talk to Sergei, to explain how difficult it was for her, but he seemed not to understand. "What are you making up?" he'd dismissively ask. "Mom loves you, just in her own way." Her own way. That's when every day you're reminded of your flaws, when you're constantly compared to other women, when they try to humiliate and devalue you. Victoria felt resentment and disappointment accumulating within her soul. She understood that her marriage was far from ideal, that Sergei wasn't the man she had envisioned spending her life with, but she continued to hope, continued to believe in a better future. She didn't want to destroy her family. She didn't want to admit that she had made the wrong choice. Victoria loved her home. It was her refuge, her fortress, her place of strength, and no one could have predicted how quickly this house would cease to be a safe haven for her. No one could have imagined that the people she considered her family would betray her in the most brutal way. Victoria was rushed to the hospital as the sun was just beginning to filter through the heavy curtains of her bedroom. It all happened swiftly. A sharp pain, loss of consciousness, the frightened faces of doctors, the flashing lights of the hospital seen through the car window. Doctors diagnosed complications from a previous surgery, and she urgently required intensive care. Sergei seemed to be in a daze. He stood silently in the emergency room, watching her being taken away, unable to utter a single word of support or comfort. In the first few days after the surgery, Victoria hovered between life and death. She barely grasped what was happening, drifting in and out of hazy dreams and fragmented memories. The fight for her life consumed all her strength. She had no energy for home for Sergei, for her overbearing mother-in-law. She simply wanted to survive. Meanwhile, as Victoria lay in intensive care, utter chaos unfolded in her home. Svetlana Pavlovna, feeling a sense of boundless authority, decided to exploit the situation for her own benefit. Since Vaika can't see or hear anything anyway, why should good things go to waste? She reasoned, gazing at the spacious living room, bathed in morning sunlight. The idea struck her suddenly to celebrate her 50th birthday in grand style, enough to make all the neighbors gasp with envy. Sergei, as usual, dared not contradict his mother. He was too weak to resist her onslaught, too accustomed to obeying her will. Besides, deep down, he hoped a lavish celebration would help him win his mother's favor, prove his worth to her. He agreed to help organize the party, without considering the consequences. Svetlana Pavlovna acted quickly and decisively. She called all her acquaintances and relatives, sent out invitations for a spectacular banquet for 50 guests, ordered expensive catering with exquisite dishes and drinks, and invited musicians, promising them generous compensation. She spared no expense, for it was her day, her triumph. The celebration began on Friday evening and lasted for 3 days. Transforming Victoria's house into a semblance of a gypsy camp, guests caroused loudly, drank, ate, and danced, paying no heed to the fact that it was someone else's home, someone else's furniture, someone else's dishes. Svetlana Pavlovna was the center of attention, basking in compliments and admiring glances. Sergei, intoxicated by wine and the general attention, felt important and needed. The tipsy guests showed no respect for the surroundings. The expensive Italian furniture, which Victoria had chosen with such love, was stained with wine and food. The antique chest of drawers, inherited from her grandmother, was broken during the dancing. Crystal chandeliers trembled from the loud music, risking a collapse onto the dancers at any moment. The garden, Victoria's pride and joy, suffered particularly. Drunken guests wandered through the flower beds, trampling the blooms and breaking bushes. The lawn was turned into a muddy mess by heels and dancing. The decorative pond, which Victoria had personally cleaned and adorned, was filled with trash and empty bottles. But the worst was yet to come. To cover the costs of these extravagant expenditures, Svetlana Pavlovna, with Sergei's silent consent, used Victoria's credit card, which Sergei had access to. They spent money indiscriminately, without a second thought for who would ultimately have to pay for their wild revelry. They ordered more and more food, drinks, and entertainment until the credit card limit was maxed out. The neighbors, observing the scene, were shocked. They saw heaps of garbage being carried out of Victoria's house, heard loud music and drunken shouts. They sensed something was wrong, but were afraid to interfere. Svetlana Pavlovna was an imperious and quarrelsome woman. No one wanted to get involved with her. Moreover, many envied the lavish celebration, dreaming of similar grandeur. Only one elderly neighbor, Baba Nina, dared to approach Sergei and express her displeasure. "Sergei, what are you doing? Veka loved this house so much. How could you allow this?" she admonished, looking at the crumpled lawn and broken flowers. Sergei merely waved her away, smiling drunkenly. "Oh, come on, Baba Nina. Why are you worrying? It's Mom's anniversary. Vaika will clean it up later. She's good at housework after all," he mumbled, turning away and heading back into the house where the unrestrained merriment continued. In her final days in intensive care, Victoria began to regain consciousness. She felt weak and tired, but her mind gradually cleared. She remembered her home, her garden, her peaceful life. She longed to return home, to see Sergei, to breathe the fresh air. She had no idea what awaited her. She couldn't fathom how her cozy world had been transformed while she fought for her life. Only a few days remained until her return, until the moment she would see everything with her own eyes and understand the magnitude of the betrayal. After her discharge, Victoria felt weak but resolute. She called a taxi and gave her address, anticipating her return to her quiet, cozy world. The entire drive, she pictured herself brewing a strong cup of tea, settling into her favorite armchair by the window, and simply gazing at her garden, regaining her strength after her ordeal. She had no inkling of the nightmare that awaited her beyond her doorstep. As the taxi pulled up to her house, Victoria paid the fare and stepped out, taking a deep breath of fresh air. But instead of the familiar scent of flowers and freshly cut grass, a sharp smell of cigarette smoke and stale food hit her nostrils. She frowned, but attributed it to the after effects of her recent illness. Her sense of smell hadn't fully recovered. Approaching the gate, Victoria froze. The garden she had been so proud of was trampled and ruined. Flowers lay broken on the ground, bushes were snapped, and the lawn was littered with cigarette butts and trash. Her heart ached. What had happened here? Empty alcohol bottles and crumpled paper cups lay on the porch. The door was ajar. Victoria swallowed a lump in her throat and, gathering her courage, pushed the door open. What she saw sent a shockwave through her. The house she had loved and cherished had been turned into a pigsty. Trash, cigarette butts, broken crockery, and remnants of food were strewn everywhere. Furniture was broken and stained. Wine spills and greasy marks marred the walls. The air was thick with the suffocating odor of tobacco, alcohol, and unwashed bodies. Victoria looked around, trying to comprehend what had happened. This wasn't just mess. It was outright barbarism. Who could have done this to her home? In the living room, amidst this chaos, sat Svetlana Pavlovna at a table laden with dirty dishes and half-empty bottles. She calmly sipped tea from a porcelain cup, as if nothing had happened. A smug smile played on her lips. "Oh, Vikusha, you're back," she said casually, as if Victoria had just stepped out for a couple of hours and we were celebrating my anniversary. Victoria stared at her mother-in-law in silence, unable to utter a word. She felt a wave of anger and despair rising within her. How could they have done this? How could they have turned her home into this? "Where is Sergei?" she finally managed to ask, trying to maintain her composure. "Sergei, he went on an errand." Svetlana Pavlovna waved her hand dismissively. "Don't worry, he'll be back soon. You have some tea for now." Victoria shook her head. She couldn't believe her ears. Svetlana Pavlovna behaved as if everything was perfectly normal, as if this were her house, and she had every right to manage it. "What happened here?" Victoria asked softly, trying to suppress the tremor in her voice. "Well, what do you think? We celebrated, had a good time." Svetlana Pavlovna shrugged. "What, is that not allowed? I was celebrating my anniversary after all, and you were lying in the hospital anyway. So, what difference does it make to you?" Victoria felt her legs weaken. She sank into a chair, trying to process what she had heard. Fragments of conversations, memories of happy days spent in this house flashed through her mind, and all of it was crossed out, trampled, destroyed. "Where are my things?" she asked, looking around the room. "Where are my photographs? Where are my books?" "Oh, come on, Vikusha," Svetlana Pavlovna dismissed. "They're not that important. We tidied up a bit, threw some things out. Why do you need this clutter?" Victoria felt a surge of fury within her. She stood up from the chair and, trying not to break into a scream, said, "Get out of my house, right now." Svetlana Pavlovna raised her eyebrows in surprise. "What are you talking about? This is my home too. I live here and I'm not going anywhere." "This is my home," Victoria repeated firmly. "I bought it before we were married and you are nobody here. Pack your things now or I'll call the police." Svetlana Pavlovna laughed. "The police? Who needs you and your police? Sergei is my son, and he has the right to live here, and since he lives here, so do I." Victoria realized arguing with her was futile. She simply took out her phone and dialed the police. "Hello? Is this the police? I want to report an illegal entry into my home and property damage. The address is..." Svetlana Pavlovna jumped up from her chair and tried to snatch the phone away. "What are you doing? Are you crazy? I'll show you the police." Victoria pushed her away and continued speaking into the phone. "Yes, I demand the immediate arrival of a unit. There is an unauthorized person in my home who refuses to leave and is threatening me." Having finished the call, Victoria placed the phone on the table and looked at Svetlana Pavlovna. There was no fear or doubt in her eyes, only determination and readiness to defend her home and her life. "I'm waiting for the police," she said calmly, "and you will answer for everything you've done here." Svetlana Pavlovna glared at her menacingly and gritted her teeth. "You'll regret this, Vikusha. You'll regret this." Victoria waited silently for the police to arrive. While she waited, she decided to see what else had happened in her house. She went into the bedroom and froze in horror. All her belongings were scattered around the room. The wardrobes were overturned. Victoria felt her head spin. She sank to the floor and cried. She felt pain, resentment, and fear. Getting to her feet with difficulty, she left the bedroom and headed to the study. There, she saw a bank statement lying on the desk. Taking it in her hands, she scanned the numbers and felt a chill run through her. 250,000 rubles. 250,000 rubles of debt that she hadn't incurred. Victoria sat down at the desk and covered her face with her hands. How could they have done this? How could Sergei have allowed his mother to treat her like this? She had always trusted him, loved him, supported him, and he had betrayed her in the most despicable way. At that moment, she heard the sound of a police car arriving. Victoria wiped away her tears and stood up from the chair. When the doorbell rang, Victoria took a deep breath and opened it. 2 police officers stood at the threshold. "Hello," she said. "I called you." "Hello," replied one of the officers. "Please come inside." Victoria let the officers into the house and pointed to Svetlana Pavlovna, who stood in the living room, glaring at her. "This woman illegally entered my home and refuses to leave," Victoria stated. "Furthermore, she damaged my property and committed fraud with my credit card." The officers listened attentively and addressed Svetlana Pavlovna. "Please present your identification." Svetlana Pavlovna refused to provide her identification and began shouting at the officers. "You have no right to detain me," she screamed. "I live here, and this is my home." The officers tried to calm her down, but she continued to shout and resist. Ultimately, they had to use force and escort her out of the house. Victoria watched as Svetlana Pavlovna was led into a police car, feeling a huge burden lifted from her shoulders. She knew this was just the beginning. That much more struggle lay ahead, but she was ready. She was ready to fight for her freedom and her happiness. Never again would she allow anyone to boss her around or control her life. Victoria acted swiftly, with a cold resolve she hadn't expected from herself. That night, after the police arrived and Svetlana Pavlovna was arrested, she barely slept. Adrenaline and anger kept her in a state of heightened alert. In the morning, despite her exhaustion, her first stop was the lawyer's office. The attorney, a middle-aged woman with a piercing gaze, listened intently to her story. She didn't interrupt, only asked clarifying questions occasionally, jotting notes in her notepad. When Victoria finished, the lawyer leaned back in her chair and said, "The situation is certainly unpleasant, but entirely solvable. You have every chance of winning the case. The house was acquired before marriage. It's your sole property. The unauthorized use of the credit card and damage to property are easily provable." Victoria felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "What do I need to do?" she asked. "First, we file for divorce," the lawyer replied. "Second, a claim for damages caused to your property and the unlawful use of your credit card. Third, we seek a restraining order against Svetlana Pavlovna, prohibiting her from approaching your home." Victoria nodded, ready for any action. She signed all the necessary documents, feeling with each stroke of the pen that she was severing ties with her past, with a past where she was naive and trusting, where she allowed herself to be manipulated. Never again. Summonses to court arrived quickly. Sergei seemed completely bewildered. He called Victoria imploring her to reconsider, saying his mother had overreacted and that he would fix everything. Victoria remained unyielding. "Did you know what was happening?" she said to Sergei over the phone. "You saw them destroying my home and did nothing. You chose her over me. Now, reap the consequences." Svetlana Pavlovna, on the other hand, remained defiant. She denied any wrongdoing and insisted that Victoria was simply an ungrateful daughter-in-law who didn't appreciate her care. She continued to claim she had done everything for Sergei, for his happiness. In court, Victoria remained calm and confident. She presented all the necessary documents, the bank statement, photographs of the damaged house, and witness testimonies from neighbors. The neighbors, initially reluctant to get involved, fearing interference in personal affairs, agreed to testify after witnessing Victoria's determination and outrage at the situation. Baba Nina's testimony, the elderly neighbor who saw everything that happened at Victoria's house during her absence, proved particularly valuable. She detailed the wild party, the drunken guests, the broken furniture, and the trampled garden. Sergei appeared pathetic in court. He tried to justify himself, saying he didn't know things would go so far, that he tried to stop his mother, but couldn't. Victoria looked at him with contempt. He had always been weak and spineless, and it was her own fault for not noticing it sooner. Svetlana Pavlovna continued to deny her guilt, calling Victoria a liar and hysterically emotional, but her arguments failed to convince the court. The court found Svetlana Pavlovna guilty of unauthorized use of a credit card and disturbing public order. She was fined and ordered to stay away from Victoria's home. Sergei was found guilty of causing damage to Victoria's property. The court ordered him to compensate for all losses, including the cost of home repairs and new furniture. Furthermore, the court granted Victoria's divorce petition. After the trial, Victoria felt immense relief. She had won and defended her home. Most importantly, she had freed herself from the toxic influence of her husband and mother-in-law. The house remained with Victoria. All expenses and compensation fell on Sergei's shoulders. Victoria sighed with relief. The first victory was hers. Now, the most challenging part lay ahead, restoring order to her home and her life. Victoria didn't delay. She hired a crew of workers who promptly and professionally carried out the renovations. She discarded all the old furniture that reminded her of the past and purchased new, modern, and stylish pieces. She repainted the walls in light hues, infusing the residence with brightness and air. She planted fresh blossoms in the garden, replacing the trampled flower beds with tidy lawns and vibrant displays. She acquired new tableware, new drapes, and new rugs. Step by step, she was transforming her dwelling back into a comfortable and secure haven. This endeavor was not merely physical, but also deeply emotional. By discarding old possessions, Victoria was shedding old resentments and disillusions. She was closing the chapter on her past and ushering in a new chapter of her life. One evening, while seated on the veranda of her revitalized home with a cup of tea, Victoria experienced a profound sense of peace. The quietude and serenity that enveloped her were precisely what she needed. Victoria finally grasped that sometimes losing loved ones is the most beneficial outcome imaginable. Occasionally, to rediscover oneself, one must relinquish everything that anchors them to the past. At times, to embark on a fresh existence, the previous one must be razed to the ground. She opened her eyes and gazed upon her home. It was beautiful and inviting, and it belonged solely to her. She was the architect of her own destiny. Never again, and to no one, would she permit interference in her life. Never again would she allow herself to be degraded or insulted. Never again would she live according to the interests of others.